All right, good afternoon. Let me just start off with a quick preliminary as you're settling in. As part of today's presentation, we're going to have clickers and clicker interaction from the students. If you're not familiar with clickers, today will be the day you'll be introduced to them. So basically, my colleagues here, we're going to go around, and we don't have, unfortunately, enough clickers for everyone. So the way we usually do it is we give one clicker per 2 students you can share. If you want to have a clicker and be part of the interactive components of this lecture, please make sure you give my colleagues your AUB ID, and then you will get a clicker, and then at the end of the lecture we can exchange. All right? So if you want a clicker as they go around now, just give them your AUB ID and you'll get a clicker. Okay? So as that's being handled, and the distribution of the clickers, I mean, just want to start with some additional preliminary notes. My apologies that this lecture was meant to be given last week, and for last minute things came up and we had to postpone till this week. And so what I've decided to do here today is, rather than have the lecture that was planned last week on Maimonides and Ibn Rushd, and then have another lecture next week on Scholasticism and Aquinas, what we're going to do in today's presentation is actually cover all of them. So good luck to you and myself as well. I have given this kind of format of the lecture of all of them in one place before, so I think it should go fine. But as I understand from your professors, some of you have already started working with Ibn Rushd, so I don't want to go back too far. So today what we're going to be doing is using the general headline of Scholasticism or medieval synthesis as the guiding, if you wish, theme for our presentation here today. And within that context, we will cover Ibn Rushd, some things about Ibn Rushd, the Maimonides, as well as our third author, Aquinas. So I want to start out by making this very, very clear. The term scholasticism does not accurately apply to Ibn Rushd and Maimonides, right? It actually very accurately applies to Thomas Aquinas, but it's not proper action, it's not fully academically proper to say that, Ibn Rushd and Maimonides can be read within the context of scholastic thought. However, they are both great influencers of scholastic thought. And what they were trying to do in their own philosophies, be it Ibn Rushd or Maimonides, certainly had a great influence on the development of scholastic thought and scholasticism, as you will then encounter with Aquinas. And so in that context, we can certainly treat the three togethers under what I'm calling here the medieval synthesis, right? And so that will be our focus for today's presentation. I want to start off by saying a few words about the painting I have up here. So when we usually speak about scholasticism, we certainly are not speaking about 19th century nor 20th century. This is a painting from the late 19th century by Ludwig Seitz. But it's a great, I think, snapshot. It's a great one-place presentation where you can capture what we speak about when we say medieval synthesis, right? And it's a synthesis of faith and reason. It's a synthesis of the religious tradition with a philosophical tradition, specifically Aristotle, as you'll see, specifically Aristotle. So this is a painting, as I said, in a 19th century painting by Ludwig Seitz. The title of the painting says it all, Faith and Reason United. And what you have here on my left hand, your right hand, you have reason, right? The personification of reason, sitting down having a lovely debate with the personification of faith, and with the following inscription by Pope Leo XIII, right above it. You can't see it in Latin. And what the inscription says, the splendor of divine truths received into the mind helps the understanding, right? The idea that divine truth or religious revelation received in the mind, this is the rational component of the synthesis, helps the understanding. Also of interest for me, this painting as a background for today's lecture is the grayscale characters you have on both sides. So behind reason on that side and behind faith on this side, it's actually the same character. And this is a personification of Thomas Aquinas, right? One of the authors we'll be covering today, and you will be covering in your readings over the next few weeks. And Thomas Aquinas is here represented sitting down teaching on both sides, behind reason and behind faith. Do keep this in mind, because essentially that is at the heart of the discussions we will encounter with Ibn Rushd, with Maimonides, and certainly with Thomas Aquinas throughout today's presentation, and I hope throughout your readings and class discussions. With that brief background in mind, I want to say a few words about the term itself, the term scholastic or scholasticus. Scholastic basically means something to do with the school, right? And it was mostly, the term developed to refer to the schoolmen of the 1200s, 1300s Europe, the teachers of the universities, the teachers of the school, right? So the term scholastic became a reference to a particular group of scholars who were teaching in those institutes, at those universities. And if you wish, at the heart of their teaching is what I already referenced as the medieval synthesis, the synthesis between philosophical reasoning and religious truth, right? And the idea that the best way to enlighten one's faith, the best way to enlighten one's revelation or understanding of revelation, also as Pope Leo XIII has says, is to receive them into the mind, right? Reasoning. So this is the tradition you'll see from Ibn Rushd to Maimonides, as if you wish, as precursors of scholasticism, as two figures amongst many that will influence the development of scholastic thought, but you'll also see this very clearly in Thomas Aquinas. I also have to say, as a note of introduction, that scholasticism is not generally positively evaluated. Scholasticism, particularly in the age of Renaissance, moving into what we call the age of reason or the age of modernity, down to our times, usually has a very negative evaluation given to it, right? And so here's one, for instance, from Laurentius Valla, who says, the superstitious and senseless race of professors, the schoolmen, who make their pupils swear never to contradict Aristotle. This is his definition of scholastic philosophers, including some like Ibn Rushd and Thomas Aquinas. Later reflection also on the scholastic or an evaluation of scholasticism comes by Hippolyte Taine in the 19th century, where he's looking at the centuries of scholastic thought with the following evaluation. He says, 3 centuries at the bottom of that gloomy abyss did not add a single idea to man's intellectual inheritance, right? So following the scholastic tradition, there was a lot of reaction against it, a break away from it, certainly in Renaissance and moving onwards. So why cover it? Why are we here today to have this presentation about it? I'm hoping that throughout today's presentation, and certainly throughout your own treatments of Ibn Rushd, Maimonides, and Aquinas in class, you will see that it's rarely ever that you can take a group of men or 3 centuries and just, wholesale say these were useless. And certainly the same is true about, saying, oh no, they were absolutely useful. I think it's one of the important exercises of the kind of approach we take in civilization studies is to have a critical evaluation, positives and negatives. And I hope throughout today's lecture, we'll look at some of the positive impact and positive influence, at least from their perspective, as Ibn Rushd, Maimonides, and Aquinas were looking at their own project. Why was it so important for them to think about the synthesis between human reason and divine revelation? Before we do so, however, I invite you, now with your clickers, to join me in the following thought exercise. It's an imagine, if you will, exercise, right? So the scenario that I want to set up before you is the following. Imagine that you are a person of monotheistic faith, of some authority, and one with broad scholarly interests. And imagine that you were informed of the recent discovery of a corpus of works, a large body of works, books and texts and whatnot, and a language of times past, And that the suspicion is that this corpus of works may hold much of the wisdom of the past. Now you're faced with the options. What do you do with this? Right? Do you procure the corpus, acquire it, and make sure no word of such discovery gets out until you can figure out what to do with it? Do you make sure no word of such a discovery gets out and destroy the corpus, burn it? Do you bring together a group of scholars to study and translate it? Or do you procure the corpus and sell it to the highest bidder? Responses already coming in. What would you do? Right? So there's the great discovery of a great body of texts, and there's a suspicion, there's a great wisdom in here, but we need to, it's a different language. So what do we do with this? Do we sell it? Do we burn it? Destroy it? Translate it? Yeah? Chris, do we have an estimate of more or less how many clickers out there? 15? Okay, so I'll wait till we hit 40 responses or less. I'm not going to wait too long. So what would you do with this? 37. I'm going to look at your results at 40 or 39. Don't be shy. All right, then. 38 is good. Ooh, look at that. So 8% would go, shh. Don't tell anyone about this discovery. All right. Keep it to yourself. 3% would destroy it. Let's show human wisdom. 87% would procure it, get a group of translators and start translating it. Good. And 3% are, I guess, business students. No, I'm sorry. That's a bad joke. I shouldn't say that. Just sell it, right? Sell it to the highest bidder. Sorry. That was really bad. I take it back. All right, fine. So let's go with the majority. Let's go with the 87% and say, all right, great. Let's translate this work. Right? But something interesting happens. As we translate the work, and the more we translate, the more we realize, or at least feel, that the content of the work stands in many ways against the accepted beliefs and traditions that we have. And that perhaps at some level, the more we translate, the more we open up this corpus, we may come across certain opinions and ideas and beliefs that may threaten our widely accepted worldview. Now what do we do? Do we make a public announcement of the discovery, urging all people to re-examine their thoughts, their ideas? Do we burn all the manuscripts and brand anyone who would ever mention them as a heretic or a criminal? Or do we continue studying and seek out from them what may indeed be of much use to us? Or do we cover up the fact that they were translated, pretend they just got discovered, and then still sell them to the highest bidder? Right? Okay, so it's a delicate situation now. At first, it was a novelty. It was a great thing we've discovered. And, yes, let's translate it. Right? But as we start to translate it, we come across ideas that may challenge our accepted worldview, that may force us to re-examine some of our accepted worldview. What do we do? Do we continue? Do we open up this discussion and invite everyone to re-examine their worldviews? Do we burn the books? It's going to be C again? I hope so. A couple of more responses before we move on. All right, we had 38 first time. Let's go, 40 this time. Good. A bit of a shift, towards a more publicizing the discovery, right? So we have less in translation, but more in terms of actually making this an open discovery. Don't hush it up. On the contrary, invite everyone to re-examine. Very 21st century of you. Bravo. Right? No one wants to burn the manuscripts anymore. That's good, because 3% wanted to do that the first time around. The interest in studying, of course, continues. And a bit more people were convinced that now it's worth a bit more to sell it. So, 5% now are willing to sell it. Fine, business-minded, why not? Entrepreneurship, I like that. This is 21st century thought, and of course, I say of course, maybe not. But generally, yes, we'd imagine that's what we'd want to do with a discovery of that sort. But the exercise you just went into is actually about 900 years old, because that was more or less the situation in the 12th century, or 11th century, actually, Spain, in Toledo. That is actually what happened. So if you're not familiar, I don't want to go back too much into historical background. There's much to cover with you today. But basically, in the 11th century, the mid-1000s, begins the reconquest of Al-Andalus, the reconquest of Spain from the European side, where, of course, Al-Andalus and Spain were part of the Arab Islamic Empire. So this is the beginning of the reconquests. And in one of the reconquests, they came to Toledo, and they discovered in a library an immense amount of manuscripts and works which the representatives of the European culture here, they had thought were lost. They had thought were gone already, mostly Aristotle's works. And so the direct decision, of course, was to make sure that that library is protected, to make sure that that library is not destroyed, because they had rediscovered the works of Aristotle, rediscovered some of the works of Plato, but also with an added value here. Not only did they rediscover the works of Aristotle and Plato and others, but they now also have with them the commentaries and translations of people like Ibn Rushd, like Ibn Maymun, Musa, Maimonides, you're going to be reading, as well as many, many others, Ibn Tufayl, Ibn Bajjah, etc. So here was a great storehouse of wisdom they had assumed was lost at one point. And in fact, exactly what they did was they brought together a group of translators and dedicated themselves to the study and the translation of this fantastic corpus. Yes, even when the more they studied it, they felt that this may actually force us to re-examine some of our worldview, to re-examine some of our understanding of, revelation and whatnot, right? So what you took as a decision today, not unanimously, but pretty decent majority, as 21st century citizens, was actually the mood of 11th century Toledo in Spain. That, of course, as usually happens in such moments of history, and we do call it the Toledo event, actually, opens up almost a snowball effect, right? So it begins, courtesy of Google Maps, begins somewhere there in Spain, the discovery and the translation, but it doesn't stay there. It starts to move around, right? People up in southern Europe, north of Spain, hear about this great discovery, and they want to be part of it, and they come down and study and take up some of the manuscripts and study. Some great work took place in Marseille, for instance, and then it continues. And one of in some sense, you could say it culminates in Palermo, in modern-day Sicily, in Palermo, where William of Moerbeke finally completed the translation of all of Aristotle's works. And William of Moerbeke is thought to be a close acquaintance, at least, if not a friend, of Thomas Aquinas. So you have a whole movement, almost a snowball effect. It also what goes up north, by the way, to modern day, what you might call England, and but a different story was unfolding at that level. And what is really interesting in this movement, by the way, is that the centers of translation coincide with centers of coexistence, right? So Andalus in general, Spain, Toledo, Carthage, Cordoba were areas of coexistence in the sense the three monotheistic faiths were all represented, they were all there, and they all were involved in this study. Likewise, in Palermo, it was one of the more friendly places for coexistence, if you wish, right? So this becomes a big movement across Europe. It begins with the Toledo event, but it goes all the way forward, and it has a huge impact on what we set out today by calling the scholastic tradition, right? Particularly as you'll see with Thomas Aquinas. So a question now about that movement. So who do you think, if you were to take a wild guess, and that's fine, we're in the business of guessing today. If you were to take a wild guess, who would you think was the main drive and engine behind the translation movement in Toledo, what we're calling the Toledo event? Who was the main person or group of people who pushed for this? Was it the common people of Toledo? Was it the political powers of Toledo? Was it the Archbishop of Toledo? Or was it the scholars and schoolmen of Toledo? As the main people who pushed for this translation movement, the main people who said we must do this? People or person? Wild guess. You don't have a clicker. Do you want one? All right. I know. This is. If this was an MCQ and an exam, you'd hate me because it's a trick question, right? It's understandable you'd go for D because we've been speaking about the scholastic and the schoolmasters. But as I said, the Toledo event leads to the development of the schoolmasters and the schoolmen. So they're not here yet. Sorry. Yes. The common people of Toledo, yeah, we wish. That's going to take a while. Even the common people nowadays, I'm not sure their influence. Political powers of Toledo, one would imagine, but I like that you gave them a low score. It was, in fact, the Archbishop of Toledo, right? Archbishop Raymond. And the reason I want to make this point and insist on it, we have a general tendency to think of the past, of the antagonism, of the animosity of religious institutes and science and philosophy and studies. Absolutely the contrary, right? Every great university that you can mention nowadays in Europe and AUB was begun by religious missionaries, right? You are aware AUB was begun by religious missionaries, right? Sorbonne, Cambridge, Oxford, right? University of Milan. So, in fact, the representatives of the church, in this case Archbishop Raymond, was at the heart of this movement. Now, that is not to say every representative of every religious institute is a great enlightened person. No, that's definitely what I'm not saying that here, neither on record nor off record. But in this particular case, it was exactly the Archbishop who recognized the absolute value of these manuscripts and recognized the absolute importance and need to translate them, study them, and yes, enlighten the worldview of the time. Right? And so again, I want to insist on this because I want us to remove this general tendency and cliche that we have that, religious institutes stand in the face of progress. They were actually, at least at this era that we're covering here today, at the very heart of the progress. When we think of Ibn Rushd, Abu al-Walid Ibn Rushd was a religious scholar, a religious qadi, and yes, a philosopher. When you think of Musa ibn Maimonides, who you're going to be reading, he was a rabbi of the Jewish community. In fact, at one point, he was the highest rabbi of the Jewish community in Alexandria. When you think of Thomas Aquinas, later aka Saint Thomas Aquinas, you're thinking of one of the greatest figures of the church at the time. So the absolute kind of harmony, as the title of Ibn Rushd's work would suggest, between philosophical reasoning and religious reasoning, so to speak, was if you wish, a given at the time. And I did pass a hint earlier on when I mentioned about the beginning of the Toledo event, and I said the Toledo Cathedral housed the translators, and that's because the bishop gave it to the translators. Again, of course, I'm not being an apologetic for religious figures, they can handle themselves. But I do want to insist on, when we speak about the medieval synthesis, particularly the medieval synthesis, we are in fact speaking about a great role for the religious institute in bringing in these newly rediscovered philosophical manuscripts and mindsets. Having said that, I have to now backtrack just a bit and say it would be very wrong of me if the picture that I'm presenting now is making it sound like all of this happened out of the blue in Toledo in 1085, right, with the reconquests. Nothing happens out of the blue. Nothing happens out of a vacuum. Socrates never woke up one day and said, I'd like to do philosophy, right? He was the teacher of student of Anaxagoras, who was, of course, the student of somebody else, etc. So nothing happens in a vacuum. And I think it's important to now keep in mind that though this was heightened interest because of the discovery of the manuscripts in trying to figure out the synthesis, interest in doing so was already going on for a while. And so I'm going to be very brief and just give you just a few examples, right? One of the earliest when we think of, when we speak about this medieval synthesis or bringing philosophy and revelation together, bringing reason and revelation together, we think of Boethius, who's a 6th century politician and administrator and philosopher, etc. And in the 500s, Boethius, as he felt that as the language of Christendom, of the empire at the time, was going more and more to Latin, he started to get worried about the Greek texts being lost, right? Who's going to read Plato in Greek if we're all going to go into Latin? We're going to lose Aristotle and these great figures and Plotinus. And so he took it upon himself as one of his tasks to begin the translation. And he translated quite a bit of Plato's works. And he wrote great works on the reconciliation of philosophy and revelation, right? One of the early works. And you already sense a bit of this with Aquinas, I think, anyway. With Augustine. John Scotus Erigena is a great, another one of these characters. He's up, and his name, by the way, Scotus Erigena, just simply means Irish from Ireland, right? Scotus at the time didn't mean Scotland. And it's very interesting because up in Ireland, Greek was still a main language. Latin hadn't overtaken the Greek as a language of education in the schools. And so John Scotus had direct access to the Greek texts. And so he was still studying the Greek Aristotle and the Greek Plato. For a similar reason, like Boethius, he was worried about losing this corpus. And here's a great, one of his quotes that suggests already his thinking of the synthesis between reason and revelation. John Scotus writes, Christ wears two shoes in the world, scripture and nature, the natural world. Both are necessary to understand the Lord, and at no stage can creation be seen as a separation of things from God. Right? So this idea of nature, by the way, was natural world, natural philosophy, natural science nowadays, you would call it. Right? So the importance of both science, philosophy in that general sense, and revelation. St. Anselm is also a great figure when we speak about the early medieval synthesis, people who were working in bringing reason and faith together. He's accredited with the very first ontological proof for God's existence, right? Proving God's existence based on the very nature of God. St. Thomas Aquinas will cover it, so I'm not going to go into details. So a quick snapshot here of some of the figures. You can mention many, many others. One of my favorites, he's not there, Haram, Abelard. Really a great, for me, a great example of this movement between science and religion, or philosophy and religion. He called his son, I'm not sure if it's a good thing or a bad thing, you decide. He had a son and he called him Astrolabe. Do you know what an astrolabe is? Astrolabe. No. It's an ancient instrument they used to measure the distances of the stars and help them navigate at night. So he was so immersed in science and philosophy, he called his son Astrolabe. I'm not sure. I don't know. It's like calling your son photon collider today, right? CERN Institute. Never mind. So there was a lot of figures. So the point I want to make is, of course, before the Toledo event and before Aquinas and Ibn Rushd, and it's not like people weren't already interested in this, right? But the discovery of the manuscripts in Toledo gave them all this new material to work with, and so you had the snowball effect that went, as I showed you, from Toledo in Spain to Palermo and up to Nice and Marseille and onwards to England. And with that, we come to what we're recording here today, our three synthesizers. Right? Sounds like DJs or something. Isn't that what they call that? Synthesizer, right, Chris? Yes, okay, great. So as I said, and again, I need to emphasize, Ibn Rushd and Ibn Maymun are not accurately scholastic philosophers. They predate the movement of scholasticism, but they certainly influence it. And that's why we want to cover them today, albeit briefly, as an introduction to Thomas Aquinas and the scholastic tradition. I'm not a big fan of going through biographies. All of this is online these days. Just want to focus on a couple of key events or key attributes related to Ibn Rushd. So something I've already mentioned. He was a legal judge, in fact, from a family of legal judges, right? And when I say legal, I hope you're not thinking civic law, right? When you're talking about 11th century Spain and you say this person is a judge, you mean religious judge, right? Qadi Shara. And in fact, at one point he was Qadi Qudat. He was chief judge of Cordoba, right? And he comes from a family of judges. So he is very much well versed in religious sciences, in ilm al-kalam, in tashri', in fiqh, in anything of the religious sciences you want to think of. He was Qadi Qudat, he was chief judge. He was also a doctor, he was court physician, right, to the emirs of the time, and philosopher. And for Ibn Rushd, that's not anything to be surprised at. For him, that's exactly what is natural. That anyone who is actually fully interested in philosophy would be fully immersed in revelation and vice versa. Right? And I hope you already started to get a sense of that from readings on the harmony of religion and philosophy. Interesting events is, of course, his exile, self-exile. Because as happened in the Arab East at one point when Al-Ghazali came on the scene and his teacher before him, Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari, the tide moved against philosophical thinking. Right? If you may remember from Professor Mario Quzah's presentation, there was a point, what we call the golden age of Baghdad, or the heyday, or al-Asr al-Dhahabi, I don't know what metal you prefer. There was an age where there was this kind of peak in the study of science and philosophy, the translation of sciences and philosophy from the Greeks, from the Indo-Persians, Indo-Asians, all that was taking place in Baghdad, with people like Al-Kindi, with people like certainly, Al-Farabi, Abu Nasr al-Farabi, and others. But then there's a moment with Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari, who's obviously, if you wish, Al-Ghazali's teacher, and Al-Ghazali, where the tide seems to move against philosophical reasoning, right? And I say seems to move because, of course, that's still an open debate. And then, if you wish, you can pan your camera over to North Africa and Andalus and see a different picture. There you can see the thriving of philosophical thought and tradition, scientific investigation, right? And very much like the heyday of Baghdad, when that used to happen, fully supported by the powers to be, right, the caliphs. Also in Andalus and North Africa, that was also directly supported by the Umara and the self-appointed caliphs, right? And so Ibn Rushd was actually brought into the court by Ibn Tufayl. Any of you familiar with Ibn Tufayl? Yeah, sorry. Lovely character of the time. Just to give you an idea of how philosophy was institutionalized, right? Philosophical reasoning. The court of the time, Al-Bilad, had one of its main aims was to draw in, to encourage philosophers to be associated with it, right? What happens later in the Renaissance with painters, for instance, and the Medicis, that, you know, you want this painter to be associated with this prince or king. And Ibn Tufayl, who was a philosopher in his own right, what part of his job was he was like a scout. If you follow football, he was like a scout for new talent, right? And he scouted out Ibn Rushd and invited him to the court because the caliph of the time was very interested in understanding some things related to Aristotle, but he was struggling. And so he asked Ibn Tufayl if he would mind writing a commentary or an explanation to clarify some of Aristotle's arguments and positions. And Ibn Tufayl at the time was immersed in writing his most famous work, actually his only surviving work, Hay ibn Yaqdan. So Ibn Tufayl says, I'm kind of busy right now, but I know someone who can help. And so he invites Ibn Rushd. And Ibn Rushd, this is how he joins and becomes really a shining star. So what happens? Exile and dying in exile. What happens is something similar to what happened in the Arab East, if you wish, in the Arab Islamic East after Al-Ghazali. The tide changes. New rulers, new powers of influence in the court. There's a move against this openness in kind of philosophical reasoning. And so Ibn Rushd decides to exile himself. Maimonides also, as you will see, has a very similar fate. Both of them die in exile, self-chosen exile. But he was very influential up to that point. Now, many say that with the death of Ibn Rushd, you have the death of philosophy in the Arab Islamic world, which I think is the stupidest statement anyone can say, sorry. Because, one can never speak about the death of philosophy anywhere. But it certainly takes on new moves, and certainly takes on new forms, and certainly takes on new directions. But this emphasis on the synthesis certainly seems to go, underground, though it flourishes, as you will see, with Thomas Aquinas and the West, right? He was, I don't know if you care, but his body was brought back and buried in Spain after he died. But he was dead, so it's too late. So you're reading, I think, on the harmony of philosophy and religion, but the full title is where I want to actually start. The actual title of the work is The Decisive Treatise Determining the Nature of the Connection Between Philosophy and Religion. And the Arabic actually does not mention philosophy and does not mention religion. It is actually كتاب فصل المقال وتقرير ما بين الحكمة والشريعة من اتصال. Right? It's not religion and philosophy, it's hikmah, wisdom, and sharia, religious law. Right? And so this is the philosopher Ibn Rushd writing, and I want to emphasize this, and I know you've already started working with Ibn Rushd, so I'm not going to spend too much time with him, but I do want to emphasize this. He's not writing a philosophy book. If you want to read Ibn Rushd's philosophy, this isn't the book you would read. Right? This is a book by Ibn Rushd about philosophy, about the role of philosophy in a monotheistic context. Right? So he's actually writing the book more as a qadi, more as a legal judge, than he is as a philosopher. And the questions are very clear in his text. His first question in the text is, what is the attitude of the law, religious law, towards philosophy? Right? So he approaches the issue from the perspective of religious law. And I want to show whether religious law allows it, recommends it, or forbids it. Right? Only if I can answer that question, can then I go on and say, all right, here's how we can benefit from this field. Right? So his initial entry point into this text And his presentation of fasl al-maqal, deciding the nature of the connection between the two, is an approach that is rooted in religious reasoning or religious argumentation. Because if religious law says I'm not allowed, I'm forbidden to study philosophy, and that's the end of the argument. Khalas, there's nothing more to say, right? But I'm assuming you've already started your work with Ibn Rushd, as I hope you will already have seen. He goes on and say, no, it actually not only allows it, but actually commands it, right? And this is the basic premise that you really, whatever else you miss out in Ibn Rushd, don't miss out on this most basic premise, right? Either, if. And this is where what his entire work revolves around. If the activity of philosophy is nothing more than the study of existing beings and reflection upon them as indications of the artisan, premise one, right? If you're familiar with syllogistic reasoning or logic, right? Premise one, premise two, conclusion. Premise one, premise two. And if either the law has encouraged and urged reflections on being, then, conclusion, it is clear that what this name signifies, philosophy, is either obligatory or recommended by law. Sorry, commanded by law. Recommended. Good? So the idea is, this is his understanding of philosophy. Philosophy is a study of existing being, mawjudat, right, as indications of the artisan. And if that is what they are, and if the law does command us to do this, then obviously the law commands us to study philosophy. Right? And so he begins with the second premise. Does the law command us to study existing beings? Does the religious law, not civic law, yeah? Does religious law command us to study existing beings? Question to you. Does it? Does religious law command us to study mawjudat wal makhluqat and existing? Yes. Right, don't hesitate. Right? For Ibn Rushd, this is one of the clearest yeses. Right? And he gives, of course, textual evidence. So you see him, he's writing as a legal judge. He's not writing as a philosopher. The evidence he's giving is not from philosophy. Right? From verses of the Quran. Right? He says, clearly God says, reflect, you have vision. It doesn't sound like a suggestion. That's fa'al amr. That's a command. Right? Of course, there are others which are more suggestions. Have they not studied the kingdom of the heavens and the earth and whatever things God has created? Yes, sure, that's more recommendation rather than command. Right? But again, in religious reasoning, if something is both recommended and commanded, which is the higher? The commandment. And therefore, his conclusion is that the study of existing beings, and if that's what philosophy does, therefore the study of philosophy is commanded. مأمور به على جهة الوجوب, is commanded, is not recommended. Right? And, sorry. This is basically the summary of that argument in the opening pages of that work. Right? The idea is, because the law obliges us to study beings, right, and reflect upon them, and because reflection means I use my intellectual reasoning, and because using the intellectual reasoning means I need to know the different forms of reasoning, I need to know the difference between a valid argument and an invalid argument, a sound argument and a non-sound argument, premises, conclusions, that means I need to study the books which tell me how to do that. The books of logic, basically, i.e. Aristotle. Once I've done that, then I can go back to reflect on beings. Right? So, if I am to reflect on beings, in other words, if I am to fulfill the commandment of God, I have to study philosophy. Right? It's almost as if the law commands the study of philosophy as a fulfillment of one of God's commandments. Right? But of course, fear not, because not everyone has to study philosophy. Right? It's for those who can. Right? And I'll leave that more for your class discussions and the details of the sources of error that he speaks about. But I will mention one because I think it's very, very important. One of the critiques against the study of philosophy that was already being raised at the time of Ibn Rushd and certainly later. How can you say that the law commands the study of philosophy when philosophy clearly leads to error? And if you're not convinced that it does, read Al-Ghazali. Right? Ghazali accuses the philosophers of 3 counts of unbelief, right? Remember them? What are they? Right? Or eternal, right? That the world is not created, it's eternal. Not body, very good. Good. that God's knowledge is of universals, not particulars. And Al-Ghazali, Abu Hamid, says, تفضلوا. This is falsafa. Falsafa leads to these conclusions which are clearly in contradiction with revelation. So how can now Qadi Qudat coming along and saying the law commands you to study philosophy, the law commands me to study something that will take me astray? That's just weird, right? But of course this is Abu Hamid. Abu Walid. This is Ibn Rushd. So he anticipates, he says, no. See, we have to recognize something very, very important. Yes, is it possible for a philosopher to commit an error? Of course. Does that mean that philosophy is the one in error? Of course not. Because the same question can arise. Can a judge commit an error? Yes. Does that mean Sharia is an error? Can a doctor commit error? Yes. Does that mean medicine is an error? Right? And so Ibn Rushd says we have to be very clear, and this is unfortunately what Abu Hamid is not clear about. And Ibn Rushd literally names him in his work. He says, haram Abu Hamid. What Al-Ghazali wasn't clear about, there's two types of error. One type which we call the essential error, i.e. the thing in itself is erroneous. And another type is accidental error. Yes, it may happen, but if it happens, it's not in the thing, it's in the person using the thing. Right? So if I were to drink water and choke and die, do you want to ban people from drinking water? It's horrendous. Because the accident is in me, not in the water. Right? On the other hand, if I drink poison and die, I don't think anyone's going to be surprised. Ooh, that was weird. He died when he drank poison. Yes, it's the essence of poison that it kills. Right? So likewise, Ibn Rushd wants to make this very, very clear. Now, why is this so important? Again, you cannot have a whole tradition. You cannot build a whole worldview that emphasizes synthesis of philosophical reasoning with revelation if philosophical reasoning is essentially wrong. Right? So you have to figure out where the errors are, and then we can move forward towards a defense of the connection between hikmah wa sharia, between philosophy and religion. And then, yes, you can speak about the harmony of philosophy and religion. Right? And it's precisely this kind of background that Musa ibn Maymun is coming from. Right? And this is, by the way, this is his handwriting. From the selections you're going to be reading from Musa ibn Maymun. Maimonides, by the way, the Ides means Ibn. So if you've watched the great, brilliant documentary 300, there's Leonidas, and that means the son of Leon. Right? So when I say Musa ibn Maymun, I just mean him. So this is from the Lalat al-Ha'irin, and it's written in Hebrew characters, but it's actually Arabic. Right? So if you were to read it, it'll be Arabic text. And he was very familiar with Ibn Rushd personally, and also very familiar with Ibn Rushd's works, and he's coming from that similar tradition. Right? Now, I'm going to again start with the title of the work, Dalalat al-Ha'irin, right? The Guide to the Perplexed. Khair, why perplexed? Where's the perplexity? Right? What would cause this perplexity? And Maimonides says, what he's actually addressing one of his students who raised this question and many others. That perplexity comes up precisely in relation to the earlier clicker question we had, or clicker exercise. What if when I study philosophy, it starts to seem to contradict what I've been told about revelation? What do I do then? Right? Because on the one hand, I can't really move away from rationality. If this is rational, I have to work with it. On the other hand, if what is rational is starting to sound like contradicting revelation, that's going to confuse me. Right? And so this is precisely what he's addressing. He's addressing how does one make sense of the synthesis between rational truth, rational argumentation, and what seems to be contradictions, right? What Al-Ghazali, for instance, raised about, these crazy philosophers are going around saying the world is eternal. Right? And Ibn Rushd comes along and says, Habibi, that's not exactly what we're saying, but, you kind of missed the point, that's fine, right? So how do you clarify? Okay, and this is what Maimonides is trying to present here, okay? The first thing we need to be clear on, says Maimonides, if you want to understand the synthesis between rational approaches, philosophical approaches, and revelation, the first thing we need to understand is, what are we talking about? What are we asking? And how much can we expect of philosophical methods in this realm? Right? So first and foremost, he will present to us what it means, not what it means, the absolute necessity of understanding of philosophical language and philosophical knowledge in order to address questions of faith and revelation. So similar to Ibn Rushd. And the illustration that you will be reading, the selections that you will be reading, has to do with trying to understand God. right? So revelation, of course, here I mean the sacred books or scriptures, whether Judaic, Christian, or Islamic, are full of references to what God is and what God is not, right? So God is just, and God is loving, and God is omnipresent, and God is everywhere. Remember that problem that Augustine also tried to struggle with, okay? So Maimonides says, what does that even mean to say God is? God is whatever attribute you want to give him. Right? Should I even be saying him? I don't know. And so Maimonides says, here's where it begins. Let's be very clear what we can say and what we can't say about God. So he says, philosophically, we define something 5 different ways. Let me show you that none of them can define God, and therefore we cannot really say anything about God. Right? The different 5 forms of definition. Sorry. The first approach to definition is description by definition, i.e. explaining of a name containing the true essence of an object. Right? So how do I define God? Right? What is God? Remember Augustine, he says, what then do I love when I love God? Probably not. Okay. That's the question. So one way to define something is by reference to its essence. So we say the human is a mortal being. That's our essence, is that we're mortal. Right? Can I say something like that about God? God is God. Yeah? And here's the important problematic here. If I say God is X, whatever X, that means X is independent of God and I'm attaching it to God. Does that make sense? Right? So if I say the chairs you're sitting on are blue, the color is independent of the chair and then is attached to the chair. Right? So if I say God is good, I'm saying goodness is prior to God and then God is good. Right? So there's no way you can define God by reference to his essence. Right? Any understanding of that is wrong. So if I say God is just and I assume that is the essence of God, then we have a problem, says Maimonides. Right? Another approach to definition is by part of the definition. So I said, no, I'm not talking about the thing. I'm talking about part of it. Right? So if I say the human is a rational animal, I'm not defining all aspects of the human. I'm defining that part where that human, hopefully, supposedly, is rational. Right? Now, can I say something similar about God? God is partly, what? Can you partition God? Can you talk about God as parts? Of course not. Because one of the basic premises of monotheism is that God is simple unity, is indivisible, right? So that doesn't work. So I'm going through them quickly. A third way of defining something is not by essence, it's by accident, to speak about its qualities, right? I'm here, you're there, you're tall, I'm not, you're sitting down, I'm standing up. God is what qualities? Of course, you cannot ascribe any qualities to God. Right? So this won't work. Fine. A fourth way to describe things is by reference to others. Right? In my case, I'm Naya's father. You are, I don't know, this person's friend, etc. Again, can you do this? Right? Long story short, none of these approaches can help us define God. Right? There's a fifth approach which is possible, which is to speak about something by reference to its action. So I can't speak about Maimonides, but I can tell you this. Maimonides is the one who wrote the Guide to the Perplexed. But that's not telling you anything about Maimonides, right? So perhaps I can speak about God in terms of his actions, but that's still not telling you anything about God. That's simply speaking about his actions, right? What's the point? What is the point of all this? Can't speak about God, this, because if one of the main central questions of perplexity, be they in philosophy or in faith, is trying to understand, again, I take you back to Augustine, what then is the God I love? What then do I worship when I worship God? Because in understanding the divine, I understand my relationship with the divine. Maimonides is saying philosophy will help you realize that you cannot hope to understand the divine in that way. There's other ways to understand the divine, but not that way. Does that make sense? Right? And so he concludes saying, in short, it is necessary to demonstrate. And when I say demonstrate by proof, I mean, again, like Ibn Rushd, why do I need to study philosophy? I need to demonstrate by proof that nothing can be predicated of God that implies any of the following 4 things. Corporeality, right? There's no way I can have a language speak about God that would suggest that God has physicality, corporeality. Emotion, but we say God gets angry. Maimonides says, yeah, no. I mean, not in the way you get angry, right? Or change or non-existence. In this respect, our knowledge of God is aided by the study of natural science, natural philosophy, right? So again, like with Ibn Rushd, The centrality of studying philosophy to help me as a means to an end. We're not talking about philosophy in itself here, right? How do I benefit from the studies of philosophy in order to answer key questions of faith, right? To help the perplexed, as he suggests. So again, here you see the synthesis, right? We're talking about how does one synthesize certain methods of philosophical reasoning, of Aristotelian philosophical reasoning to be specific, with certain questions of faith and revelation. This is exactly what you will see in Thomas Aquinas. Obviously, time is almost up, right? So just to close very, very quickly, the very method that Thomas Aquinas uses is a perfect illustration of the synthesis. What Aquinas will say is, I have a key set of questions, right? The key set of questions end with the third one, right? Does God exist? But I cannot answer you that question unless I've shown you that I can actually answer that question, that it is possible to demonstrate that God exists. That's question number 2. And I cannot do that if you think I don't need to prove it because it's obvious, right? Because one attitude in religious reasoning is God's existence is self-evident, it's obvious. You don't need to prove God's existence. Look around you, right? He says, that's not a very good argument, says Thomas Aquinas. And of course, he'll show you demonstratively, i.e. using tools of philosophy, he'll show you why that's not a good argument. Right? And the brief of it is, if God's existence is self-evident, how come some doubt it? Yeah, that's an obvious counter-argument. Right? The second counter-argument says, these are objections to him. Right? So in the text, you'll see he uses the terms objections and replies. Objections are not his. Those are objections being raised against him. Right? So a second set of objections against Thomas Aquinas is, fine, okay, God's existence is not self-evident, but guess what? You can't prove it. No matter what you do, you won't be able to prove God's existence, right? So he addresses them, again, demonstratively, philosophically, to show that it is possible to prove God's existence. Not essence, not what God is, but that God is, right? Having shown that, he'll move to the third set of questions. Does God exist? And as you will read in Thomas Aquinas, he will give not 1, not 2, not 3, 5 proofs for God's existence. But I want really to leave you with this. None of those proofs alone works, so you can't pick and choose between those 5 proofs. They work together, right? And those 5 proofs are not modes of conversion, they are modes of conviction. This is a very important point. None of these philosophers are saying, I can philosophically convert you, right? But I can give you proofs, and I can give you rational argumentation if you already have that faith. Does that make sense? Right? Conversion is a totally different question here. Good? Thank you so much. Thank you. Make sure you give back your the clickers and get back your IDs. It's too much to cover in one. Oh my God.
This to put your presentation on the.
Very good.